So, Jim, diving right into our topics today, the first one up on deck is there was a tweet by our president, Donald Trump, this morning, and he says that he has just signed what he's calling the most important and largest trade deal in U.S. and world history. It consists of the United States, Mexico, and Canada working together to create and sign the USMCA. What are your thoughts on this, and what are the implications for U.S. trade going forward?
Well, it is a big deal. So I think for the president to take a little credit and kind of trumpet this is entirely appropriate. Although I love the way the president says the greatest trade deal in the history of the world. I mean, you go back to Alexander the Great. He had his own version of globalization. He just went out and conquered everybody, but he had a pretty good trading area. But it is significant. I wouldn't underplay it. So first of all, it's U.S., Canada, Mexico. Now everyone talks about the U.S.-Chinese bilateral trade relationship, and we'll talk more about that. But 80% of the Canadian population lives within 30 miles of the U.S. border. It's their own country, but, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, a number of the big cities are just over the U.S. border. The car industry between Mexico, United States, and Canada has been integrated for a long time. So it's almost, it is what NAFTA was intended to be, which is the North American Free Trade Area. But what Trump did, he got, as he puts it, a better deal from Mexico and Canada. More jobs for U.S. workers, more inputs from the U.S. Remember, if Mexico's doing assembly, well, they're buying parts from someplace. And Trump said, why don't you buy some of those parts from the U.S. and we'll have some assembly in Mexico. We'll import the cars. But there's more jobs and more input from the United States in the supply chain. Likewise, Trump's threat vis-a-vis Canada was to put tariffs on Canadian cars, which coming into the U.S., which would have just killed the car industry in Canada. And Trudeau knew that, so Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland, his foreign minister, they did a good job negotiating, and they got a few points their way, but they didn't have that much leverage. And that's really the brilliance of Trump. Trump starts out with a goal, which is a good way to do things. Some people just kind of go into things not knowing what they're trying to do. Trump has definite goals in mind, definite numeric reduction in the U.S. Trade deficit. But then the next thing he says before he sets out a negotiating path, he says, where's my leverage? What's the Achilles heel of the party I'm negotiating with? And in Canada, it was easy. It's car imports. So he says, okay, if you don't see things my way, we'll put tariffs on your car imports. So that's done. So a couple of things. It does change things from NAFTA. The president, the mainstream media just, they can't wake up in the morning without thinking of new ways to criticize Trump. So they say, oh, it's just NAFTA with a new title. It's, old wine in new bottles, whatever. That's not true. I mean, it's not tearing NAFTA to shreds. A lot of NAFTA is retained. But there's a 323-page technical appendix to what this is, with lots of provisions in it. And I think it's important to remember who's behind all this. Trump's the policymaker, and Trump, takes the credit. But Robert Lighthizer is the U.S. Trade Representative, not a household name. Most people have never heard of him. But he has ambassador rank, so he's Ambassador Lighthizer. The U.S. Trade Representative is a cabinet-level position. So this is somebody who, in the hierarchy of things, would be on a par with the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State in terms of serving the president. And Lighthizer is very, very smart. And I don't mean just in the technical sense, but he keeps out of the press. He doesn't leak. You don't see his people couldn't pick him out of the lineup. You don't see his face. You don't hear about him. Lighthizer is very happy for, Peter Navarro, who's also a special trade advisor, or Larry Kudlow, who's the head of the National Economic Council. Whereas Lighthizer is very happy to let them be in front of the cameras, let them take credit at press conferences. He just keeps out of it. But he's the real power. He's the one the president listens to. You can tell that he has the president's respect because the president has never dinged him on Twitter. Like, Trump will go after his friends as quickly as his enemies. Mitch McConnell's getting like 50 judges approved, and Trump will say something, that'll get McConnell stirred up. Although I think McConnell's pretty used to it at this point. But you never see him dinging Lighthizer. And just another insight, Lighthizer has a house in Palm Beach, which is where Mar-a-Lago is. And there are a lot of weekends when, whether it's the Thursday or Friday morning, the president will just say, hey, Bob, I'm going down to Mar-a-Lago. You want to ride an Air Force One? And Lighthizer will say yes. And they get on the plane and they have 2-hour one-on-one with no distractions, no visibility from the press. And so there's a special relationship there. And Lighthizer did this for Ronald Reagan. He wasn't USTR, but he was top trade advisor to President Reagan. And Lighthizer is running the Reagan playbook with the Chinese. Now, at the time he was with Reagan, early 1980s, the problem was Japanese auto imports. Detroit was falling apart. They couldn't make a good product. The Japanese had very high quality automobiles, very low price points. They were killing Detroit. And Lighthizer got Reagan to put very high tariffs on Japanese autos. And it left the Japanese with a choice. On the one hand, they took away their price competitiveness because you put the tariff on top of the price. Now all of a sudden Detroit was competitive. But what you were really saying to the Japanese is, look, if you make a better car, make them here. He forced the Japanese to put their auto factories in the United States. They're in Tennessee, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Ohio, and elsewhere. And they said, you can make all the cars you want, but make them here. And the Japanese did that because they, in fact, instead of paying the tariffs, they jumped over the tariff wall and put their plants in the United States. And they've done very well ever since. But what we got out of it were hundreds of thousands of high-paying jobs with good benefits. They're not union jobs because getting around the unions was another part of it. But Lighthizer's job wasn't to help the unions. His job was to help American workers, and it worked. So now, 35 years later, they're applying the same playbook to China. They say, hey, you want to make cars? Fine, make them in the United States. We're going to slap tariffs on you, and that'll give you an incentive to come here. I love people in these, wealthy zip codes driving around in BMWs to say, I got a German car. And I'm like, no, you don't. You have a South Carolina car. That's where they make them. So Lighthizer is very seasoned, very smart, has the respect of the president, stays behind the scenes, but is the most powerful voice in all this. He's with the president right now down in Buenos Aires, getting ready for the big dinner coming up with President Xi. So they have a playbook. They have seasoned people to run it. The Chinese are going to find out the hard way that you can either work with Lighthizer and work with the president, or you're going to suffer the consequences. It's not like we don't have enough cars in the United States. So, of course, it's not just cars. That was the Japanese playbook. Today, it's, iPhones, electronic components, textiles, a lot of other goods, including manufactured goods, that are affected by this. So, Trump had a big victory with Canada and Mexico. He's on his way to another victory with China, but not soon. This whole Chinese thing is really, really going to drag out. One footnote on USMCA, that's the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the new NAFTA, is that it does not end U.S. tariffs on steel and solar panels. And Canada and China were the two major sources of U.S. solar panels. I wouldn't buy anything from China. You couldn't give it away as far as I'm concerned, but the Canadians do have very good quality, and they put a 30% tariff on those. So, but that's not included. So there's still some unfinished business with Canada, but that's going to get back to, our dairy products in places like Vermont, Wisconsin, being able to get into Canada, et cetera. So, still some unfinished business, but a big breakthrough. President deserves a lot of credit. but it shows that the brains behind the operation is Lighthizer, and he's also on point with China.
So just briefly thinking about what you were saying is that, signing this deal, Trump being the negotiator that he is and the businessman that he is probably giving him some pretty strong momentum moving into the G20 for his preparations to talk with the prime minister, et cetera, from China.
I think that's right, and of course, all eyes are on this Saturday dinner. I think what's interesting, I think the China story is being over-reported. I'm not saying it's not important. Of course, it's important, but it's all you hear about. But to me, the bigger stories are the ones that are not being reported, and it's more. I'm kind of more intrigued by what's not happening than what's happening. What's not happening, the president is not meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, who's the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and at least as of now, the next king. We'll talk a little bit more about that. He's not meeting with Vladimir Putin. He was planning on it. He wants to meet with Putin, but because of what's happened in the Kerch Straits between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, involving really a military naval confrontation with Ukraine, and Ukraine is retaliated by, they declare martial law on themselves. So I don't know what good that does, but Ukraine has declared martial law, and they've also just announced a ban on Russian men between the ages of, I think it's 16 or 18 and 60 years old entering Ukraine. I thought that was sort of ridiculous, because if the Russians want to go into Ukraine, they'll just walk in. I mean, eastern Ukraine are two breakaway provinces that are de facto under control of Russia. So if Russia wants to, so maybe you can't get off the plane in Kiev, but you can certainly walk into Donetsk or the eastern areas of Ukraine. I don't know why they cut it off at 60. I think you can cause a lot of trouble even if you're over 60. So these are things that Ukraine feels they have to do, but it's all for show. I mean, the real question is, can the Ukrainian Navy stand up to the Russian Navy? The answer is no. And if you don't get, I saw someone the other day, it was a Democratic politician, but they were saying, we should give the Ukrainians, ship-to-ship missiles, basically missiles that can sink ships, give the Ukrainians some missiles so they can stand up to the Russians. I thought to myself, great, that's just what we need. A Russian vessel being sunk by an American cruise missile. I don't think that's the way to de-escalate. So Ukraine's kind of stuck. Are the Russians bad guys? Sure, I bet they always have been in certain ways. Certainly when it comes to their periphery, the territory. I mean, the strategic thinking behind this. Russia, if you look at it on a map, and particularly a topographical map, it doesn't have any natural boundaries, natural borders between it and potential invasion. Now you got the Ural Mountains, but all the important stuff, St. Petersburg, Moscow, the Crimea at this point, they're all west of the Ukrainian mountains, which means that it's just a big plain from the Netherlands to Moscow. It's just a big plain. Napoleon proved it. Hitler proved it. You can roll over it now. You might have your hands full when you get to Moscow, but there's nothing stopping an invasion. So what Russia has always done, they've always had buffer states. Like, okay, maybe we're vulnerable from a topographical, geographical point of view, but if we have a bunch of states, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Georgia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, around us, you got to come through them first to get to us, and that gives us a little buffer and gives us a little time. Now, most of that has been lost as a result of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the dissolution, breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, and a period of about 10 years of disorganized chaos in Russia when they were pretty weak, back on their heels. The U.S. and NATO and our European allies, contributed to the liberation of a lot of those countries, along with obviously the sacrifices and bravery of their own people. And they broke away from the Soviet Union and they're not coming back. But the two or three areas where control was ambiguous or at least uncertain were Ukraine and Georgia. And, go back to 2007, Russia invaded Georgia. They didn't take the whole country, but they took the northern half of it. And now you just have a mess in Ukraine where the U.S., Ukraine had a functioning democracy, and they elected a pro-Putin president. Prior to that, they had more Western presidents. But there was kind of a modus vivendi there, which was that Ukraine was still nominally Western, looking to the West, but they had a leader who was close to Putin. So both sides were kind of happy, and they probably should have left it that way. But what happened is that U.S., UK, CIA, MI6 in 2014 got involved in one of these color revolutions and chased this guy out of town. He's now in exile in Moscow, and they got a more favorable leader. And Putin's like, wait a second, I finally got a friendly guy in there, and you depose him. Where's your commitment to democracy? And then from there, Putin said, okay, two can play. He took Crimea. He destabilized eastern Ukraine. The U.S. throws on sanctions. It's just been escalating ever since. And everybody wants to make Putin the bad guy. I'm not saying he's a nice guy, but they say, Putin started this when he took Crimea. And Putin would say, no, you started it when you destabilized Ukraine. Taking Crimea was my answer to that. So we've been in this escalating scenario ever since. And Trump would probably love to meet with Putin, but there's a whole angle here with the Mueller investigation and Michael Cohen, the president's former lawyer, giving testimony about Trump Trump and his so-called lieutenants or associates talking to Russians about hotel development long after skyscraper development, long after he looked like he was going to get the nomination or during the primary season. And my first thought was, well, the guy's a hotel builder. What is he supposed to do? I mean, Trump himself said this morning, he's like, well, what if I lost? I can't miss the business opportunity. I don't want to get into the legalities and ethics of it. Maybe, the problem with people in Washington, Alex, is they're so political 24/7. They've had their entire careers either in elective office, staff positions, bureaucracy, the Pentagon for decades. They have no experience in the real world of business. They don't know what it's like to negotiate, building a skyscraper, building a hotel, trying to finance it. Of course you ingratiate yourself with the leaders of these countries. That's what you're supposed to do. I worked at Citibank for 10 years. I mean, the country head of every branch in the world, they told you your job is to ingratiate yourself with the elites. Don't try to make loans. We got loan officers for that. Get to know the finance minister, get to know the prime minister, etc. So Trump it was his own version of hotel diplomacy. But of course, you read the Washington Post, this is a smoking gun conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. But my point being, we'll see how that plays out. I think Trump will handle it well, but it's a pretty bad time to go meet with Putin when there are all these supposed revelations popping out and going on the Washington Post and all that. So, I think he somehow could have got past the interdiction of the vessels. I don't know if you saw that video. There's like a Russian, a lot more about the Navy than I do, but I couldn't tell if it was a destroyer or maybe something lighter than that, but it ran this, Ukrainian tugboat. The boat's sitting there in the straits, and here comes this vessel. I'm watching it. I do a lot of sailing. I'm like, he's going to hit that guy. And sure enough, he did hit the guy. But, I guess if you're going to hit anything, a tugboat's a good choice. But, the point being, I think Trump could have got past that, because there's a lot we need to discuss with Russia, including arms treaties, sanctions, can the two of us get together and at least hold hands and confront China in certain ways. There's a lot of important business, but this Mueller thing has been clouding the issue for 2 years.
Do you think that this is leading up to a Russian push towards more territory in Ukraine, possibly?
Yeah, I mean the gloves are off, and if Ukraine's like, well, we're gonna declare martial law, and your people can't come here, and we're trying to beef up our navy, and we're going to assert our rights in the Sea of Azov and all that. Well, this opens the door for Russia to escalate. It's like, if you're going to pick a fight, don't pick a fight with the school boxing champion. I mean, that's the problem. You can go through the motions and you can posture, but I don't see the only leverage Ukraine does have, although the Russians are working hard to negate it. Russia dominates the world of natural gas. They deliver a very high percentage, in some cases 60 or 70% or more of the natural gas that goes into Western Europe to basically keep houses warm, keep factories going, and run various industrial applications. And if Russia turns off that tap, a lot of Europe will be freezing in the dark, literally, and a lot of factories will close down, literally. Now, those pipelines run through Ukraine, and there have been disputes about this, and the Ukrainians didn't pay their bills. This goes back to some of this 2006, 2007, but even more recently. And then Russia will literally turn off the tap and cut the gas supplies to Ukraine. But Ukraine can do that in reverse. Ukraine can either turn off the tap, or if Russia says we're not giving any more gas to Ukraine, but we want you to keep sending it to Poland or Germany, Ukraine can divert that gas to Ukrainian applications and cut off the Poles. So there are all kinds of gas wars going on. And that's where Ukraine does have a little bit of leverage. But again, in this escalation scenario we're talking about, if Ukraine did something like that, you could see Russian troops coming in and turning the taps back on. So, and then what's the U.S. leverage? We don't even, Putin or Trump can't even talk to Putin for 15 minutes in a private hotel room in Buenos Aires. How are we going to confront Russia and Ukraine when we've given up? That was by hitting Russia so hard with financial sanctions, travel bans, seizing assets, et cetera. We've already thrown everything we can to the Russians short of an act of war. So if Russia escalates, what are we going to do? I mean, there's not much we can do. You can kick them out of SWIFT. That's a good way to start World War III. That's not going to happen. So, in some ways, the Russians, this is typical of Putin because Putin's two favorite sports are chess and martial arts. I mean, he's obviously a very smart guy, but he knows a little bit about turning an opponent's aggression against them, turning strength into weakness from the U.S. perspective. And where he is now is, hey, you've thrown everything you can at me. I'm still standing. And now if I do something, you got nothing left.
Yeah, it makes total sense. In fact, when I saw this come up with Russia basically capturing those three ships, the first thing that occurred to me was that he's testing response.
Yeah.
Trying to see. And I agree with you with everything that's happened. Every time Trump has anything to do with Russia, the media is all over it and they try to turn it into some kind of negative circus. Basically, you've removed his ability to do anything sort of at a negotiating level, and now it's just down to, okay, well, they're going to do what they're going to do, and we're going to have to do what we have to do later.
Right. Right. Meanwhile, as you know better than anyone, they're buying 30 to 40 tons of gold per month, not year, but month. And they haven't quit. I mentioned before, between 2014 and 2017, Russia's reserves were drawn down by $200 billion. They went from $500 billion to $300 billion in reserves. And during that, and that put a lot of stress on the economy, and they couldn't refinance their corporations. But they did it by reducing their dollar assets, but they never sold an ounce of gold. and they never stopped buying. Even as their total reserves were going down, their gold reserves were going up. They would buy 10, 15, 20 tons a month, even as I said, the reserve position was melting. So now that the reserve position is growing again, it's back over 400 billion because the price of oil is higher. I mean, I know it's down recently, but it's higher compared to the $24 it was in 2015. They're buying more gold. So, and Putin's, unlike the Chinese, I mean, the Chinese and Russians are doing the same thing. The difference is the Chinese are, sneaky about it and they pretend otherwise. The Russians are very transparent. They update the Central Bank of Russia website once a month like clockwork. And Putin says, we're getting out from under the dollar. And, others want to do the same thing and others will join quickly, but he's taking concrete steps.
What's so interesting to me about that is that they're clearly setting themselves up to be able to operate financially, even if they're on complete financial lockdown. And in other words, if things go to a kinetic level or become much more hostile and they're completely locked down financially from whatever Western systems are controlled, they can still operate. And it blows my mind that so many people miss this about gold. So many times people are like, well, gold's no longer money, gold no longer backs any monetary systems, yada, yada, yada. But what people miss is gold is money for sovereigns in time of serious conflict.
Right. First of all, that's absolutely right. And this is much further along than people understand. And you just described the situation perfectly, but a lot of people hear that and go, oh yeah, they're working on it. 10 years, forget 10 years. They're almost ready to go in about 10 months. And I actually recently guest lectured a very elite team of strategic thinkers from the U.S. Army War College. And this is one of the things I drilled down on. I actually showed them what's going on. Just imagine the following. In fact, you don't have to imagine because it's happening. So Russia builds, creates a cryptocurrency. And we're not talking about Bitcoin. Please don't go out and buy Bitcoin. That's kind of a dead end. But you create your own Russian cryptocurrency, an e-ruble or a Putin coin or whatever. China does the same thing. They link up with an I'll call it an internet, but it's completely segregated from the main internet. You just run, cables and satellite relays between Shanghai and Moscow, and boom, there you are. And they make it what's called a stable coin, which is it's pegged to a certain benchmark, not meant to fluctuate. The benchmark is the special drawing, right? The SDR from the IMF. Everyone's like, oh, there's going to be gold back you want. No, there isn't. I mean, China doesn't have anywhere near enough gold. There's not going to be a gold backed ruble. Both countries have awful rule of law. If you transacted, what's your recourse? Who are you going to sue? You really want to be in a Chinese court? I don't think so. But you could have these digital currencies on a distributed ledger pegged to the SDR. Then from there, because there's a dollar equivalent, you are de facto pegged to the price of gold, to the dollar price of gold. But the point is, it is a stable coin. Now, and then you invite others to join this network. So the obvious candidates would be start with the pariahs like Turkey, Iran, North Korea. But hey, Brazil has expressed interest. South Africa has expressed interest. And most of the BRICS would come in. Venezuela would come in. Okay, you don't have the U.S. That's the big giant. But the whole idea is to get out from under the U.S. So now you have a private internet. You have a distributed ledger with a Putin coin or Xi coin with stable value equal to the SDR. Okay, it fluctuates against the euro and the dollar, but so do the euro and the dollar. I mean, that's not unusual. And now you start trading. So, North Korea sells weapons to Iran, and Iran sells oil to China, and China sells, infrastructure projects to Russia. Russia sells technology to China. Turkey gets in on the act. Brazil's selling soybeans to everybody. and you denominate everything in these new coins, in these new tokens. Basically, denominating them in SDRs is what you're doing, but your medium of exchange is a private coin in a private network. And then you do what countries have always done, which is you just keep tabs. You don't pay for everything in real time. You just run maybe the vendors do, but the countries run a balance of payment surplus or deficit with each other. And then periodically you settle up. Could be monthly, quarterly, or annually. But here's the catch. You settle up in gold. Gold equivalent to one, Putin coin or whatever. And you just fly the gold around. Just put it on a pallet on an airplane. The nice thing about gold is it's got great density. You get a lot of value on a small pallet. So the plane lands in Moscow and Putin sticks in his vault, or the plane lands in China and they stick in the vault in Shanghai. And notice everything I just described does not involve the dollar.
Yep.
Digital coins, private network, stable value, gold settlement, extensive trading network, and the dollar's not even in the mix. That's what they're doing.
Yeah. They can even figure out what they think their net payments are going to be, and they can keep some amount of gold in their own account in that nation. They wouldn't even necessarily have to fly it either. I mean, they could if it was a lot, and they might want to, but historically a lot of that's been settled just with gold's already sitting there.
Well, first of all, that's absolutely right. And for that matter, you could put this gold depository in Switzerland. So the Russian gold, the Chinese gold, the Iranian gold all goes to Switzerland. And we do what the Fed does, just change the nameplate. Say, hey, it's gold, now it's yours. Everybody trusts Switzerland. I mean, nobody trusts Russia or China, but everybody trusts Switzerland. So that's right. You could have a central gold depository in Switzerland, and it would be a very efficient system. And it's coming. Like you said, they're already working on everything I just described.
Yeah. Now, back to Putin for just a second. Interestingly enough, I saw a picture of him sitting right next to the Crown Prince of Saudi at the G20. And Saudi's had some really interesting things going on with it. Over the last year, we did a podcast. It was around the time that this happened a year ago, where the Crown Prince basically came in and went on this huge program of reformation.
Right.
And promptly rounded up and arrested all these different family members from the House of Saud. They froze and confiscated hundreds of billions of dollars of assets.
Right.
And it was a huge shakeup. If you're interested in getting the history on that, you can go back through our archive and we did a podcast on that. But and then recently there's this other thing. They've been pouring tens of millions of dollars, Saudi has, into PR. Mm-hmm. They've hired firms in the United States, and they've hired firms in the UK. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to fight back against this recent situation where apparently there was this journalist that appears to have been captured, tortured, and murdered at the hands of Saudi Arabia. Right. And we're not absolutely certain about that, but it's kind of looking that way. So what are your kind of thoughts on U.S.-Saudi relations? Where are we going with this in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alex. Just going back to the shakedown operation, the craziest thing about that, instead of putting all these oligarchs and princes and multi-billionaires, members of the royal family, in like a prison, they put them in the Ritz-Carlton. They basically turned the Ritz-Carlton into a high-end prison, but they were confined nonetheless. I've actually seen some, a couple folks I know happened to be there, and you just get a little, your iPhone camera out and scan a little bit. Don't be too obvious. And you see guys, princes basically sleeping on the floor, men in black walking around with, M4 automatic weapons and all this stuff. So, but I remember thinking at the time, the good news, bad news. The good news was most of the money they was trying to get back was probably improperly stolen to begin with. And so in a sense, they were just recouping for the state what had been stolen from the state. He basically took a third. So if you were worth $30 billion, he's like, give me $10 billion and I'll let you out. And most people took the deal. And some people didn't. There's a few people are still confined. One of the holdouts was, Prince Alawi, who was, I don't know, might be worth closer to, 40 or 50 billion, who knows, but he had to pay up. And they all did. So it was sort of nasty and, it's not legal by Western standards, but this is typical Arab behavior. I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but, when you look at the history of Arabia and the Bedouins and the Al Saud family prior to the first third of the 20th century, they never had economic growth. They never had technology, unless you want to go back to like the 10th century. But what they did is they stole from each other. And so the way you got wealth was you stole somebody's sheep, you stole their goats, their camels, took their water, and this would start a feud, and then a bunch of people would get killed, and then there'd be a peace treaty, whatever. But it was never about growth, it was about taking. And so this was sort of again, an updated 21st century high-tech version of what they had always done culturally. Now, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, is trying to grow the economy. He's got some project. But I remember when they did this thing with the princes, the royal family, and the Ritz-Carlton, I said, you better come out on top. You better make this work. Because if you don't, you've just made more blood enemies and created more blood feuds than have existed in that peninsula in 500 years. So you better not screw up, because you just bet the ranch on this. Well, he did screw up. He screwed up with this Khashoggi murder, which is what you were referring to. I don't think anyone's seen the smoking gun, as General Mattis said, but we can draw our own conclusions. The CIA has estimated, that's their word, that the Crown Prince was behind it. I'll leave that to those intelligence channels, but it certainly looks that way. And now the problem is, because he's in his early 30s and he's sort of coming off as the hothead. On the one hand, he was the modernizer. He let women drive. He recovered money for the state. He announced big projects. It was all part of Vision 2030, where they were going to turn this into a real country instead of an oil pumper. But now he's gone too far, and the royal family knows it, and they're looking around for alternatives. So the reason I'm kind of giving all that background is when you get over to Trump, if you're the Washington Post or all these other left-wing publications, you're like, oh, Trump's horrible. He won't denounce Khashoggi. He's, kind of maybe did it, maybe didn't. He's equivocating, et cetera, as if Trump didn't know what happened and wasn't willing to hold him accountable. But you have to think of these things from the U.S. perspective. We're not out to do any favors for anybody in Saudi Arabia. We're out to do favors for ourselves. And the U.S.-Saudi relationship is critical. It's critical to cutting off oil to China. It's critical to confronting Iran. It's critical to building up alliances with Israel. This relationship, in Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States together produce almost 40% of the world's oil. U.S. is number one, by the way. We're like a dark horse, came up from behind. But in round numbers, U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Russia produce about $10 billion barrels a day. The U.S. is now slightly above that, but those 32 billion barrels are, I think, 37% of global output. So the relationship almost could not be more important. So you can't blow up the relationship. Now, you don't push MBS aside until you have something to replace him with. So you might not like him, you might not hold him in high regard, you might think he's screwed up, but this is no time to go public with that, because you either have to give him a chance to make some kind of amends, and I don't even know what they would be, because this is pretty horrific, Or, and I think this is what's going on, give the royal family time to come up with an alternative so that when they do, pull the rug out from under MBS, there'll be somebody who can come forward. So this is an example, we all, I think we all memorized the script from The Godfather. We don't need to think about anything else because there's a line for everything. But, that famous line, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. If MBS has now become a liability, let's say, more so than an enemy, keep him close, get his mind at ease until he gets whacked. And so what I see going on is Trump, being publicly critical but not blowing up the relationship for two reasons. One, the relationship is too important to blow up. It's bigger than one man. And two, give the royal family time to come up with a replacement. And they have a guy. There's one son, I think Abdul Aziz, who was the first king of Saudi Arabia of the Al Saud dynasty. This goes back to the 1930s. He had, I don't know the exact numbers, but order of magnitude, something like 45 wives and, 75, 80 children, most of whom by now are deceased or they're too old and not functional or whatever. But there's one a half brother, one son of the king, the original king, who's 71 years old. He must be one of the babies in the family, but seems perfectly capable of taking over. And I think that consensus is forming. And so, but meanwhile, MBS is not the king; he's the crown prince. So the king King Salman is ailing. Reports are he's still the king, but he's not well. So his days are kind of numbered. So what I see is a setup either where the king is induced to dethrone his own son, make him not the crown prince, and bring in this other guy, or the king dies, but there's another step. The line of succession is not automatic. It's not like the UK, for example. MBS does not automatically become the king, even though he's the crown prince and the sort of king in waiting. There would be a family council. There would be sit down. And that council, that might be where the coup happens, and they bring in this other 71-year-old, younger son of Abdul Aziz to be the next king. So they could be setting up for that. It's a deep game, but I think Trump is doing a good job of not blowing up the relationship for the sake of one ne'er-do-well.
Sure. Okay, so why don't we move on to the G20? Some of the issues that I've been seeing come up, some of the major issues are, of course, the trade war. Everybody's talking about that. Trump has been talking about the tariffs that he's already imposed some, is threatening to impose more. In the past, Trump has called China a currency manipulator. I think he's sort of backing off of that rhetoric a little bit. But in my personal opinion, he's doing for effect, just to position himself for future negotiations. That's one of the interesting things I think that people miss about Trump is he's pretty bombastic or outspoken or whatever the case may be. But I think it's all pretty much a game to prep for further negotiations. But there's also the issues of the confrontations that have continued to go on in South China Sea. There's Taiwan, the one nation policy. There's the steel dumping thing. To me, though, some of the biggest issues are intellectual property theft and cyber espionage. So we did a piece about cyber espionage in our last podcast where we're talking about how at a factory level, the Chinese were embedding little microchips on motherboards that are in servers in sensitive areas in U.S. infrastructure. Lately, I saw an article. I think it was the chief technology officer of Cisco, where he was verifying that the largest telco out of China, they actually have points of presence, POPs, which are internet nodes in the United States that route traffic. And they've been routing U.S. domestic traffic. In other words, this is traffic in the U.S., from the U.S., meant for the U.S. And what they're doing is they're using what's called BGP routing to take all of that traffic, they're sending it to China, and then they're bringing it back to the U.S. and sending it back where it's supposed to go. So all of those kind of things happening. And then, of course, there's the issue of intellectual property theft, which by some estimates is as high as $600 billion a year worth of intellectual property being stolen. So what do you think are like the key things that we need to be focusing on for G20? What do you think is going to happen with this dinner on Saturday night? Where is all this leading to?
Yeah, the short answer is nothing's going to happen with this dinner. Now, could there be a little, let's call it a mini agreement where, China agrees to keep talking about Section 301. Section 301 has to do with penalties for the theft of intellectual property and tariffs on, we got them on the solar cells and steel and consumer electronics at this point, which is the big one, and China's thrown tariffs on a lot of our stuff, and they're buying soybeans away from the United States. Keep talking, have it's called a mini package where Trump delays the activation of the tariffs. And by the way, just a quick aside, a lot of people don't understand how these tariffs work. They know what a tariff is, but the way it works under the trade laws, the 74 Act and 62 Act and the Administrative Procedures Act, you announce them, but then you have to have like a 30 or 60-day comment period. Affected parties get to comment, then you get 30 days to consider the comments. You might tweak your policy a little bit, and then it goes into effect. Or even then, when you get over those procedural hurdles, you have the ability to put it into effect, but you don't have to do so right away. It's kind of on standby, so it's like a sword of Damocles, if you will. So we're just getting through that right now, where some tariffs that were announced in May and June are just now getting to the end of this notice and comment period. But they are in a place where they could put them in at any time. And Trump could say, okay, we'll hold off. So it's really a gun to the head kind of strategy. We'll hold off for now. We won't pull the trigger, but we expect to see some results from you. That could happen. So it's not much of substance, but it would buy time. And very typical of the Chinese approach, which is, buy time and lie. That's their negotiating approach. And Trump's approach is, find your leverage and go for the jugular. So the kind of conflicting strategies here, but not a big deal, not an end to the trade wars, not anything that's going to resolve any of these issues. It might be nothing. They might come out of it with nothing, but if they want a little something just for show, it could be along the lines I'm describing, but I don't think the market's going to buy it. It's funny watching the stock market go up and down along with Trump's, tweets or statements. Trump will say, well, I really do want to do a deal with the Chinese. The stock market will about 500 points. And then the next day I go, I don't know, I'm going to throw these tariffs on anyway. The heck with them. The market will go down 500 points. And you can't fight the market. I'm not telling people to, buy stocks or go short or any of this stuff. I'm just saying, it's amusing, except it's more than amusing because there's so much money involved, to watch the market react to what is obviously a kabuki performance by Trump. This is how he keeps his negotiating opponents off guard. This is how he keeps everybody guessing. He confuses the heck out of everybody, and you never know what he's going to do. So you're like, oh, what do I got to do to keep this guy happy? I mean, this is the Trump, this is the art of the deal, so to speak. But the point being, to see the market take it seriously is a little absurd, but that's kind of how markets work. So let me explain what's actually going on. And I'm not going to repeat everything I said about Robert Lighthizer, but everything I said when we were talking about Canada applies to China. So he's on point. He's a tough negotiator. He's taking a hard line. Peter Navarro is the guy with his hair on fire, but he's taking a hard line. Larry Kudlow's been tranquilized, so he's now sort of with the Trump team, even though he hates all this, and Mnuchin, same thing. So So they're going to go in there and they're going to insist on a lot more. I know the Chinese are not going to give it. This is more than a trade war. You know, go back to January when the trade war started. I said, this is not going to be resolved easily. It's going to escalate a lot. It's going to affect world trade. It's going to affect markets. And Wall Street kind of shrugged and said, oh, no, it's posturing. It's, you know, Xi's got a strut and Trump's got a strut, and they're not going to let this get out of hand and all that stuff. Well, now, you know, 11 months later, it obviously looks like the forecast of a long drawn-out costly trade war is a lot closer to the mark than the idea that they're just posturing. So, but the market has begun to wake up to that. The market's like, you know, maybe this is for real. Maybe this is going to drag out. So I think they've gone from being dismissing it too lightly to starting to take it seriously. And that being the case, when they had this final communique on Sunday, if there is one, some of these international meetings lately, they don't even have a final communique. They can't even agree on some happy talk. So, but let's assume there is one. But if it doesn't have anything of substance, or even there, where the deal is very kind of superficial along the lines I described, I think the market's going to say, you know what, this is going to get a lot worse. And it's also gone beyond trade wars. You know, I've always made the link just between currency wars and trade wars. They can be separate, but usually it starts with a currency war and ends up as a trade war. But that doesn't mean the currency war is over. It just means that you're now fighting two wars at once. And China's doing that. The Chinese have devalued the yuan from about 6 to the dollar to 7 to the dollar in about 7 months. That's a big devaluation. That's an almost 20% devaluation. And the way it works, the math is, let's say the Chinese have a product and they sell it for 100 into the U.S., and Trump slaps on a 25% tariff, and all of a sudden it's 125 to the U.S. buyer, counting the 25% tariff. But then China devalues the currency 20%, which lowers the unit labor costs. So you kind of get the price down to 80, slap the 25% tariff on. Now you're back to 100, which is where you started. Now the money gets divided differently. The U.S., you know, the Chinese manufacturer has got to pay the tariff, but they take it out of the hides of their workers, who now their currency is not worth as much. Now you don't cut their pay. You pay them the same amount of yuan. It's just that it's been devalued 20%, 25%. So you can't, if you want to buy something from the U.S., they don't buy much from the U.S. anyway. I mean, average Chinese factory worker isn't putting in orders for, 1,000 tons of soybeans. So you fight the trade wars using the currency wars when you don't have enough trade war tools. And that's already been going on. That goes back to your point about Trump getting ready to call them out on the currency wars again. But this is even bigger than that. And here you go to Mike Pence's speech a few weeks ago, which they're now calling the Pence Doctrine, which I think is interesting because Trump's the president. But the Pence Doctrine basically says, yeah, we got a currency war, we got a trade war, we have theft of intellectual property, we have penalties, but this is all part of a much bigger struggle for supremacy in the 21st century. We're not going to let China dominate 5G. We're not going to let China buy U.S. companies. I used to say, you couldn't buy IBM, but you could buy an ice cream company. Well, no, I'm not so sure about the ice cream company. I mean, they seem to be shutting China out of everything. Huawei can just, lose our number. They're not going to sell anything in the United States. And they're starting to get kicked out of other countries in the sense that they won't buy their stuff either because of all the trap doors and back doors and stolen technology that you mentioned. And of course, the South China Sea, freedom of navigation, relations with Japan. There's just a whole long list of things that go way beyond economics. And some critics have described it as a new Cold War. And I think that that's not far from the case. And so those are all additional reasons why the trade war is not going to be over, because it's part of a bigger war that's far from over. So yeah, they're going to have dinner. Maybe they'll smile for the cameras. Maybe they won't be smiling. But the idea that it's going to be any big breakthrough, I think, is a stretch. And that means on Monday, we could expect a very negative reaction from the stock market.
Yep, I think you're right. Okay, last thing. We have just a couple minutes left, Jim. So we haven't talked about the Fed in a long time. It's been a number of podcasts we've gone through, and we're mostly hitting geopolitics, some gold, et cetera. But how about a quick little update on what the Fed's up to and what we could look forward to from them for the next quarter or so?
Sure. And one reason we haven't discussed the Fed is until a couple of days ago, they weren't doing anything. So, no, my Fed model, and I want to emphasize that my Fed model comes from the Fed. It's not, I think about this stuff all the time, but I don't mind talking to people who sit in the room with whether it's Powell or Yellen or Bernanke. And I have one source in particular who is the most informed, influential, and highly placed source inside the Fed other than the chairman. And he's not a governor, he's not the chairman, but he sits two doors down and basically does all the wordsmithing, all the descriptions, all the orchestration behind all the policies, and therefore has to understand the policies better than anyone else. So he explained this to me. This is kind of, I'll say I know it, but I do know it. And it's really simple. And why the markets don't get it, why more people don't write about it or talk about it, I have no idea. But I've had very, very good forecasting results as a result of saying this, which is really simple. The Fed is out to raise interest rates 4 times a year, 25 basis points each time, every March, June, September, and December, like clockwork. So that's your baseline. Just 4 times a year, 25 basis points each time, boom. Until they get to about 3.5%, maybe higher, depending on conditions, but 3.5%, 4%. Why are they doing that? Well, they've never said this publicly, but the reason they're doing it is because they want to get interest rates high enough so that when the next recession comes, they can cut them enough to get out of the recession. And the research is clear, and Larry Summers has done a lot of this, but others have as well, that number is about 4%. So how are you going to cut rates 4% to get out of a recession if you're at 2.25%? Well, the answer is you can't. And so what happens is if we had a recession tomorrow, they would cut 2.25%, they would hit 0. Same situation Bernanke found himself in 2008. I say, well, now what do? I can't cut anymore, but if I don't cut, I can't get out of the recession. Well, the answer is QE4, QE5. They don't want to go there. They will if they have to, and they've said so, but they don't want to go there. What they do want to do is get rates to 4% so they can cut 4% and get out of the recession without going to QE4. So that's what they're doing, and that's why they're doing it. Notice that nothing I just said has anything to do with the neutral rate, neutral in quotation marks. Neutral rate is first of all, an invention. It's one of these egghead theories that nobody can quite pin down. There's widespread disagreement over what the neutral rate is. I say, if you can't even agree on what the neutral rate is, have you thought about the fact that maybe there is no such thing as a neutral rate? Maybe there are too many factors, too complexly, too intertwined from a complexity perspective that anything such as the neutral rate, even in theory, doesn't really mean anything because you've got too many other things, psychology, velocity, the out of the work, labor force participation, too many other factors to pin it on one thing. But so the big stock market rally on Thursday, I believe, it might have been Wednesday, but it was up, 600 points. What was that all about? Well, what it was about was Jay Powell gave a speech to the Economic Club of New York, and he said, we're very close to the neutral rate. So Wall Street said, aha, if neutral rate means not too high, it's like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just the exact rate needed to maintain economic growth without slowing the economy or giving it too much juice, as if there was such a thing. But anyway, they said, well, if he's close to the neutral rate and he gets to the neutral rate, he's going to stop raising rates. That's sooner than we thought, because the last time Powell said something about this, which was a few months ago, he said we're really far from the neutral rate. But that was off the cuff. That was not a prepared speech. It wasn't one that my friend had written. So he says, we're really far from the neutral rate. And markets go, oh, man, it's going to be raising rates forever. And then this week he said, we're really close to the neutral rate. Well, that was nothing more than a do-over. That was just Jay Powell correcting in a formal setting something that he said offhandedly and probably got it wrong the first time. And remember, Powell's a lawyer, not an economist, so he doesn't have this in his DNA. So that's what it was. By the way, I read the speech before he was done delivering it. 80% of that speech was about risk management. It had nothing to do with interest rate policy. So this little blurb was in there in the front. So the market said, okay, well, he's going to stop raising rates, and we thought it would take longer, and therefore rates are going to be lower. He's a dove. Discount factors are lower. So stocks go up, up, up. And then they slept on it. They said, maybe that's not what he meant. Well, what I'm telling you is it is not what he meant. I mean, well, sorry, he may have meant that, but that has no bearing on interest rate policy. The idea that they're going to stop at 2.5 or 2 3/4 because that's the theoretical neutral rate is nonsense. They're going to go to 3.5, 4 for the reason I mentioned. But they do pause. But they pause for reasons that have nothing to do with the neutral rate. They pause if you had a severe stock market crash, job losses, or extreme disinflation. Look for those three things. If you see one, certainly if you see two of them, they're going to pause. But if you don't, they're going to keep raising.